Trump is doing things 100 times worse than they imagined, yet American artists remain silent. That was the headline in Le Monde last month, with columnist Michael Guerin asking, where did the American artists, musicians, actors and writers go? During Trump's first term, he pointed out, everyone from Chris Evans to Cher to Robert De Niro to Beyoncé queued up to denounce the president. But now there is meek acceptance. The same is in the case of the law. For instance, the elite firms Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher and Flom LLP agreed to provide $100 million in pro bono legal services to causes that the president and Skadden both support, rather than defend its own DEI policies. Business bent the knee early. We can see it in the corporate donations to the Trump inauguration. And academia is facing the lash too, with Columbia University caving to Trump's demands in order to hang on to its $400 million of federal funding, after which Trump sought federal oversight over the university anyway. The reason is simple: fear. Not just fear of the mean tweet, as in the first Trump term, but fear of defunding, ostracism, investigation by the DOJ, and even violence. Molly, how has it happened so quickly from resist and not my president to, like, tumbleweeds?
So, again, there's more nuance here than that. So there are some law firms that have behaved very cowardly. By the way, good luck getting your associates to represent coal miners, right, suing the EPA. I mean, what these law firms are doing is really disgusting, immoral, and not courageous. The thing about Trump's first term is that that resistance actually worked. Even if it was cringe, even if it was trite, even if Americans got sick of it, it actually worked. It kept a lot of norms and institutions in place. And so the fact that it's not happening this time is really, really bad. Now, that said, there is some of it happening, right? Like some law firms have caved, but a few have not, and they are suing the administration. Trump continues to lose in court in a really profound way. And in fact, the Supreme Court just ruled against him, right? 9-0. Even Thomas and Alito, and those guys are practically Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson. So that was pretty shocking to me. So I do think certainly it's not a great moment in American life, and it's not a great moment for American democracy. But I do think that it's a little more complicated than that. And you are certainly seeing people speak up against Trumpism. You know, it's not as chic as it once was. And I think I want to just go back to the billionaires for a minute. The billionaires were always just going to be billionaires, right? There's a reason they got to be billionaires.
Yeah.
They made moral compromises along the way that got them to the place where they are today. So I don't think that anyone should have been looking to those people for any kind of guidance when it comes to morality or politics writ large. I mean, those people were always in it for the tax cut. And law firms too, right? These people are the people who have, they're not public defenders. They're not government workers. They're the people who went in for the paycheck. And so, of course, they're not going to be moral and upstanding. And of course, they're going to take the most politically expedient route. What we need to see is our academic institutions stand up to Trump and Trumpism, and also our artists. And I think we're seeing more of that. Would add there are two college professors who are actually really standing up, and that is the president of Wesleyan and the president of Amherst. So there is what I think is the most important in a way is that these universities that are caving are actually just opening the door to more and more. So Columbia has caved and now Trump wants more, right? They canceled $400 million in grants. And again, Elon Musk has also canceled all these National Institute of Health grants for cancer research, for things like that. But what Trump has done here is he is now going after Columbia and trying to put it in receivership. So there's a really good case study here about why caving to Trump only makes Trump worse. And you have to, when you are faced with a bully, stand up for yourself.
Do you think that part of the silence on the behalf of the creative arts, entertainment, celebrity, effectively what America has instead of royalty, we've got the royals, you've got Hollywood, is part of it like down to maybe a feeling of guilt, like they were all in for Harris and it failed, and that now effectively they just have to turn away from it? Do you think?
I go back to my grandfather Howard Fast, right, who was blacklisted during McCarthy. America, we have a long history of doing really immoral things as a government. This is not new. This is not, in 2016, there was all this discourse. This is not who we are. This is exactly who we are. We are the country of Jim Crow, right? This is who we are. And the fact that people are behaving in a cowardly way during the rise of McCarthy, this is exactly how everyone behaved. So the idea that there is, and in fact, the mainstream media behaved 10 times worse during that period. So the fact that there's so much cowardice, I don't think should be surprising. And I also think that's why it's so important for us to be brave. And that is why, courage is contagious. And we just all have to stand up for rights, norms, and institutions, and for the people who are being targeted by this administration.
You reported on the hands-off demos across the US this month. Literally millions of people turned up. There was
millions of people.
1,200 anti-Trump demonstrations, same scale as Black Lives Matter, possibly bigger. Have we got to the final, the last result? It's got to be the people who sort it out.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I was interviewing the minority leader, Chuck Schumer, the Senate minority leader, on my podcast, Fast Politics. It's up today. And he was saying, if the constituents have enormous power, and I don't think they understand that. Here is the Senate minority leader saying, call your senator, call your congressman, get in the streets, peacefully push back against this authoritarianism. Part of the problem with this sort of more nuanced approach to Trumpism was that when Trump didn't see people marching in the streets, he sort of felt he had a blank check to do whatever he wanted. Now, I actually think he thinks he has a blank check to do whatever he wants either way. But there are people around Trump, Republican senators, Republican congressmen, who still have to win elections. And that is why we do need people in the streets peacefully. We do need people calling their senators and their congressmen, especially in red states, is really important. The American people do not like this. The polling shows that this is not, Trump is really almost back to where he was in his first term. This is not, authoritarianism is not what anyone in America wants, except for a very small percentage.
What was the vibe like on those? I mean, obviously, you didn't go to all 1,200 demos. You're fast, but you're not that fast. What was the vibe like on the hands-off demos?
Peaceful. I mean, there was no arrests, or I don't know if there were no arrests, but there were very few. It was a very, very kind of peaceful protest. And I think that there really is an opportunity here for that to continue. And I think that is going to be the only way to protect our norms and institutions, is going to be just a lot of pushback at the public level.
It is kind of encouraging when you see, over here we see stuff shared from like town halls in MAGA districts.
Yeah.
You see demos in MAGA districts, and people are furious. It's not just
furious. Yeah. I think it's important to remember that this is not just Trump authoritarianism, but nothing else. It's like authoritarianism, but messing with Social Security, authoritarianism, but cutting benefits for people, authoritarianism, but firing huge swaths of the federal government. So there are going to be intended consequences like harder to get your Social Security, and then unintended consequences like less funding for cancer research. And even a great example is that they cut the sort of food safety inspections. So we're going to have more people, getting food poisoning. And food poisoning, we have, for example, a great example is we have children dying of measles in America. This has not happened in 20 years. This is because Donald Trump put RFK Jr. in charge of government health. RFK Jr. actually has, and this is something he said in his divorce filing, a brain worm. So now we have children dying of measles. I mean, I don't know how to express to you that American exceptionalism is dead better than that we have children dying of measles, and that the head of that RFK is saying, if only they had taken more cod's liver oil.
He needs to listen to the brainworm. It probably knows better than he does. Seth, Michael Guerin in Le Monde called it Trump's counter-reformation. Is that what we're getting? Is it a full spectrum reordering of society?
I think that's very much how they see it. I mean, if you look particularly not just Trump himself, I don't think Trump has an ideology. He has instincts and obsessions that he's been obsessively repeating as mantras since the 1980s. But if you look at someone like Stephen Miller, who's been so influential in the direction of Trump, and even someone like Steve Bannon, who isn't currently in the administration but is still part of that wider MAGA movement, they all have this vision for upending society as a massive cultural project. And owning the libs is a part of that. Total economic turmoil is a part of that.
Although I did like the line last week, which is the way the economy's gone, they will only be able to afford to rent the libs.
Yeah.
So that was
good.
bang
That was
on.
very good. There was a sort of Republican project from about William F. Buckley Jr. onwards that was popularized by Reagan, that was this sort of free marketeering thing that went all the way through to George W. Bush. And this whole MAGA thing under Trump is the departure from even that. It's a completely different scale of wackadoodlery. And yes, it causes chaos, but Trump loves chaos. He revels in chaos. He sees when there's chaos, attention focuses on him. He's the story in that sort of way. And I mean, Molly spoke about the billionaires who are along for the ride. I very much agree with that. One of the things that's very noticeable if you talk to these people, as occasionally with some of my other sort of interests I have to do, it's very revealing how open they are behind the scenes about the fact they know Trump's nuts. They know that he's incompetent. They know that he's barely sane and borderline gaga, but they want lower taxes. They want to scale back the state. They want to fire federal employees. They want to cut Social Security. All these things they're willing to go along the ride for. What they didn't anticipate was tariffs and inflation and the stock market tanking.
Well, the justification for authoritarianism is usually, well, at least the trains ran on time.
Yep.
And here it's like, the train has been sold for scrap and the railway has now been completely torn up as well. Not even that works. One thing that really strikes me is the incredible, in the kind of environment of fear that we see from this side of the Atlantic, how incredibly petty it can be. There was the case of, the weird portrait of Trump in the Colorado state capitol, which made him look better and more handsome than he really looks. It was actually quite a nice, it looked from one angle, it was kind of dictator flattering rather than.
It was quite lifelike.
Yeah, it was as good as he's going to look. But he expresses his displeasure, and the artist has had a career ruined. She didn't even set out to mock or deride him, but it's just one of the hallmarks of a totalitarian or an authoritarian environment is you never know when or how you're going to offend the dear leader, and when you do, you're screwed. That just really stood out to me because I don't remember a precedent for that.
No, I mean
America at least.
I do think we were somewhere along these lines the last time around in terms of how Trump's court around him operated. What's different, though, is that he totally has captured the GOP in a way that wasn't true 6 months into his first term. Back then there was a John McCain, there was a Mitt Romney, there had already been a special counsel appointed to investigate Trump, and indeed his first reaction on hearing of that was, this is the end. I mean, it didn't prove to be the end, but there was some feeling that even though Trump had the House, he had the Senate, he had the Supreme Court was already conservative leaning, there was nonetheless a feeling that it was weighed.
I don't totally agree.
Mhm.
I would say, yes, there were some Republicans, they ended up behaving quite cowardly too. I think that the people had more faith in Mueller and the sort of checks and balances of the courts than they do now. So I think one of the sort of bad scenarios was there was a feeling that Trump could be stopped by Mueller or could be stopped by one thing. And now it's clear that really has to be to gum up the works, make everything as slow as possible, and then win at the midterms, protect protect the elections until then. I do think Trump benefited from this kind of amnesia, the United States of amnesia, but also this amnesia from the post-pandemic amnesia, which is something that we have seen with the 1918 flu pandemic, that history has there has long been this kind of setup. So I do think that he benefited from that, but I also think that the goal is just to make sure we have elections in 2 years and to win all of them, and then to just push back. And you've seen even like Democrats have really changed. They were more tepid, and now they see that voters are furious and they're trying to push back now.
But that's going to be tough. I mean, the Senate map in 2 years' time is not looking particularly good, it has to be said.
Yeah, it's not a great map, but If you look at the way the last set of we just had a special election, two Florida seats going, blue about 7, 8 points, and also this Wisconsin Supreme Court election that was, Wisconsin is meant to be sort of exactly split, and Democrats way overperformed in that. And Elon Musk just poured money into it. I think it was the most expensive judicial race ever. I think he put in something like $100 million, and it absolutely did not move the needle, which in my mind is a very good sign. So next in 2025, we have in November, we have election for the Virginia governorship, which already Democrats are way ahead with Spamberger. And then we have an election for the New Jersey governorship, which again, I think will be a huge overperforming. And so then you look at the Senate map and you see Maine, which is a Susan Collins seat. But you could really see a world where Maine, which is pretty split, goes to the Dems. North Carolina, the Tom Tillis seat, has always been something of a sort of dream. And if you're seeing the kind of headwinds that we've been seeing before, then you could see that. Then you have this Ohio seat, the J.D. Vance seat, which is up. And if you could get Sherrod Brown to run for it again, could see a world where Sherrod Brown is able to get back into the Senate. And then you have a Nebraska seat, and you have a guy called Dan Osborne, who is really, really great and almost won that seat last time when it was Deb Fischer. So you could really see, look, a lot has to happen, but if Republicans hit the kind of headwinds and we have free and fair elections, it's not impossible. I don't think they win the Senate, but I think they could make up a lot of ground.
Ros, the scholar of fascism, Timothy Snyder, has complained about pre-compliance, obeying in advance as a precursor to authoritarianism. But, not complying is a lot easier said than done when your livelihood is at risk, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad Timothy Snyder said that. But Timothy Snyder is one of the people who can say that because as a public intellectual, he enjoys a very privileged position. If you're working in the federal government, for example, you're in a very, very different position if your livelihood depends on doing what the government wants you to. However, corporations have also done it. Legal firms have done it, as we heard earlier, which is less forgivable. This is going to be the world's tiniest violin. I'm not expecting sympathy for it. But I was scheduled to do a seminar on trust for an American organisation that you will have heard of last November. And they cancelled it after Trump got elected because apparently it was decided after that we couldn't talk about trust anymore. So I was somewhat shocked. I shouldn't have been, but I was.
And wasn't the telltale phrase, in the current climate?
Yes, it was in the current climate. Yes, and for a while it was, we have to think about it, and then eventually they admitted they weren't ever going to think about it again. So, yeah, I think perhaps it's better to ask for the ordinary person rather than Timothy Snyder. Is there a way to get your message across without putting a job in danger? Can you do that by talking to journalists? Can you do that by organising, supporting people who are being persecuted? Is that still possible in America? Arguably, yes, it is.
And not to knock Timothy Snyder, he is brilliant. We were great admirers, but he has himself left for Canada with his wife. And again, as a public intellectual, that has its own power, doesn't it? You've made a statement which the world will pay attention to. But the idea that intellectuals have to flee the country does seem insane.
His argument would be that this is just the beginning and things are going to get an awful lot worse, and there will be a time when to be Timothy Snyder in America will be to be pounded, terrible things could happen. And I respect that point of view. If you look at the history of how democracies have gone bad, you might, it's an argument you can well make. But being able to flee a country is a privilege. And I get a bit, I suppose, a bit antsy because I think of all those people I knew who somehow got Irish passports after Brexit, who had no interest whatsoever in having an Irish passport before. And, it's a valid choice. And I have people listening who did that, and that's fine. And it's a security in a way. But it's also really, to me, it was a bit saying, oh, okay, I can ship out any time. And, I can't ship out any time. There's nowhere I can go except Great Britain. I have to stay here. And there's, as I say, it's a privilege to be able to leave. And I think in America, but it's especially hard to think about because almost every American has their story of how their parents or their ancestors or they themselves left in search of a better life, and they came to America. And the idea that America might now be a place that you have to flee from is cognitively really hard to get your head around. Maybe that makes it easier to think about fleeing. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
Molly, the semi-quincentennial is coming up in 2026. Are you looking forward to America's 250th birthday with Trump in the big seat? Lots of military parades and John Philip Sousa and things.
Yeah, we love pageantry, and Trump have been trying to get a military parade going. One of the things that and there's been, he's cutting the federal government, but he's actually, when you look at this, so he's trying to pass these tax cuts right now, and when you look at what he's doing with the budget, he's actually the military budget will be even higher. So it'll be interesting to see if he kind of gets away with this. We have really, this is yet again another incredibly stupid moment in American democracy. But I do think he will try, to spend a lot of money. And again, one of the things the New York Times reported this weekend was that despite the fact that Elon Musk is saying that Doge is cutting all of this spending from the government spending is still going up.
I mean, I can vaguely remember the bicentennial as a grand celebration of the American idea and the nobility of it. I even bought Captain America's Bicentennial Battles, a giant comic book about how amazing America is. Is it going to be possible to celebrate that idea in the same way in the middle of what I believe could be termed a shit show?
Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine 2 years into Trump's second term that Americans will be delighted to celebrate democracy. Yeah, it seems like a bad situation. I'm glad to see, one of the things that has worked, which is worth just talking about for 1 second, is that behind the scenes, the District of Columbia, the area that surrounds the White House, went 90% for Harris and 10% for Trump. It's filled with federal employees. It's very small, and it doesn't really have much power because it's meant to be a district of the federal government. And what has happened is the mayor, a woman called Muriel Bowser, has managed to really negotiate with Trump quietly and by sucking up to him, and has managed to be able to keep a lot of her funding. So there are things going on behind the scenes that you may not be seeing that are ways in which federal government employees are trying to keep the money that they're supposed to have by sort of North Korean style dictatoring.
Just to wrap up then, I mean, we mentioned McCarthyism more than once in this conversation. The McCarthy fever passed in the end, as your family knows. Do you have to wait it out? Do you have to wait for that fever to go?
Okay, so this is what I would say. Yeah, a little bit, yes. But we already are seeing Trump do these wildly unpopular, wildly stupid things, right? Like last week, we had Jamie Dimon go on Fox Business to beg Trump to pull back the tariffs because he was crashing the public markets. So if we're this just normal authoritarianism, I think we'd be in much worse shape. But the reality is we are in authoritarianism, but it's headed by a moron who is completely convinced that all of his ideas are brilliant. And so what's happened is that the public is starting to see that. And I think that, watching Jamie Dimon try to get Trump to pull back on the tariffs and then Trump pause the tariffs is a pretty good indication that ultimately he doesn't really know what he's doing. And he's kind of governing on vibes. And that's bad news, but also good news, because it means that this is not going to be the authoritarian slide that a lot of us were worried about. That in fact, Trump world is deeply incompetent, and that incompetence needs to be, needs to be focused on and needs to be reported on and needs to be messaged to the rest of the American people.
In the first term, we used the headline E pluribus moron, and I really wish we'd hung on to it for this time around.